was like, do you want to hear about the time I got a tattoo of a penis while I was in Ireland?
We do.
He did too.
That's Sara Lohse, aka a storytelling badass with a penis tattoo. Full story behind that in the episode. But speaking of stories, Sara just launched her book on helping thought leaders like you and I discover and tell our impactful stories to the world. And that's what today's episode is all about. How to discover and tell your personal brand story. Together, we'll learn the importance of storytelling for our personal brands.
This silly little story that I would tell as a bartender, it changed the way that I moved forward in my career, and it became the premise of my book.
How to discover which stories are worth telling.
Not every day is good, but there's good in every day. So pay attention to those little moments that if you were just going through the motions, you would have missed, because those little moments can turn into such great stories.
And how to get over the fear of being open and vulnerable online.
I am publicly imperfect because it is authentic. I think when you do that, it takes the power away from everybody else, because what are you going to say about me that I didn't just say?
So let's learn all about our stories we're sharing together on this episode of Brand Science. Let's start right at the top with, you wrote a book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a huge accomplishment. This is, the book is titled Open This Book, The Art of Storytelling for Aspiring Thought Leaders, which I love that first part, open this book, how it's such a call to action. Like, you know, which if you're looking on a shelf and you see that, you're automatically like, all right, now I have to open this. How'd you come up with that title?
So it's kind of almost a pun a little bit. Like part of it was like, I'm telling you to open this book just because, like, please open my book.
Right.
But it's also, the book is about storytelling and personal stories. So it's like you're becoming an open book. So it's like double entendre.
Yeah.
But I love it so much that I worked with an illustrator, Jasmine Designs out of Australia, and she added some like little doodles and little quips in the book and everything. But she even puts on the like half cover page on the inside where it just says the title, Open This Book. She adds, "Oh, good, you did." I'm obsessed.
Chef's kiss.
Yes, it's like the rest of the book can be decent. My title, that is the one place where I'm like, I'm proud of that.
Sure. No, 100%. I love that. Yeah, how I read it was like, open this book. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess I have to now.
Exactly. It's like, do you not listen?
Yeah. Follow directions. Step one. So I thought it would be great, very on topic, would be to start with you telling us a bit about your story, background, career, and then what inspired you to write this book and what was the process of writing this book? Because I feel like there's a lot to be discussed there in terms of obviously storytelling, imposter syndrome and everything, and then creating that book. I'm sure you felt a lot of that as well.
Absolutely. I actively did not want to write a book. And I always was a good writer. It was like the one talent I ever had. Like I might not do great on every test, but I always straight A's on every paper. But I didn't want to be an author. And I didn't realize that there were other jobs that involved being a writer. So when I finally figured it out, we're going to cut that one out.
Yeah, we don't keep it in. This is about authenticity, right?
Oh, I keep bloopers in all of my podcasts.
Yeah, I saw that. Was great.
I just realized my like phone was next to it and it vibrated. It would have been annoying.
Please, this is like the movie theaters. Please silence all cell phones while recording.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to start that over now.
We're keeping it in, by the way, so it doesn't matter.
That's fine. Honestly, yeah. I drop things a lot.
Yeah.
When I finally did actually start my career, I started as a writer and I was an advertising copywriter. And I fell in love with writing even more, but I still never wanted to write a book. And it wasn't until years later, I have a ridiculous story about an accidental tattoo. And somehow that shaped my entire career to this point, because I was at a conference, Podcast Movement, and I was producing a podcast for a financial planner that I was the director of marketing for. And I wanted to get him booked on Stacking Benjamins. I don't know if you know it. It's a big finance podcast.
Yeah.
And I stalked him for 3 days. I swear, like hiding behind a book at a cocktail table, might as well have had like eyes cut out of a newspaper.
Oh, geez.
Like it was very sad.
Yeah.
But after 3 days, I finally meet him and I pitch him like, this is who I think would be a great guest. He's an expert in this, and he has these letters after his name. And Joe just looks at me. He's like, yeah, that's great. I don't need an expert. I need someone with a cool story.
Mm.
And I just didn't want the conversation to end there. I was like, I feel like I can make this happen. So I was like, do you want to hear about the time I got a tattoo of a penis while I was in Ireland?
We do.
He did too.
Yeah.
So he's like, absolutely. And you're booked on the show. So I accidentally got myself on the show to
Um,
tell that story. Not a money story. At that point, like I've since become accredited as a financial counselor. I actually, it can be considered like a financial expert in like some arenas, but I was not at that point. I literally came on to talk about a bar crawl in Ireland that ended with bad tattoos. But the way he walked me through telling that story kind of taught me how to tell it. And it taught me that this silly little story that I would tell as a bartender to get like the guy sitting by himself to smile and maybe tip me more. Like that's how I use the story. And I actually realized that it has value and it has lessons, and you can take any story and make it valuable if you tell it right. So it changed the way that I told my stories. It changed the way that I kind of moved forward in my career, and it became the premise of my book.
that's crazy. That's what's interesting too is I feel like we always get a little bit too wrapped up in this idea that our story needs to be this like Steven Spielberg, huge blockbuster epic, but we
Yes.
don't realize that there's kind of micro stories throughout our lives that we can still link to value and can still impact someone's life and change their life. For you, it definitely impacted your life. But yeah, we don't need to necessarily, be this grand, when we think of like the top people in business, they always usually have some sort of like garage to multi-billion-dollar business, and like, sure,
Yeah.
great, but for the average person we still have like our version of that, it sounds like, which that's like one of the big things with misconceptions around storytelling. What I loved in your book, which I admitted to you early in our chat here, is I wasn't able to read all of it because it just came out like Thursday and I can't read that fast, but I've read a lot of
I've
it,
forgiven you.
and I'm loving everything I've read so far. But one thing that stood out to me was you said your story doesn't have to be big or earth shattering to be impactful. Your story simply has to be told in a way that is honest, authentic, and shares who you are and what you've experienced, which I think is nailing everything you just talked about. Can you kind of elaborate on that concept of like, how do we pinpoint stories in our lives that maybe we don't think is important, but yet can still be impactful for audiences?
Yeah, I think that whole misconception comes from the society that we're living in, where we are in a 24/7 news cycle. We are constantly being bombarded with headlines. And those headlines are newsworthy. They are headlines. So we feel like those are the stories that people want to hear. But like you said, with the person that works out of their garage and then becomes a multi-billionaire, like the apples of the world, those aren't relatable. Like, I don't know about you, but I did not build a computer in my garage and then become one of the richest men in the world. It did not happen.
Yeah.
So we can hear those stories and we're inspired and like, that's awesome. Like, great for him. Now I have a cool phone. But it doesn't relate. Like, we don't really feel a connection to it. And with storytelling, it's all about connection, and connection comes from shared experiences. So when you tell a story that's more like someone else has probably been through this too, and you're giving your what led up to that event and what you learned from it, and maybe making it so that other people who are headed in the same direction can sidestep some kind of mistake that you've made, those are the ones that are relatable because people go through that same thing.
Right. The average person isn't building the iPhone.
No,
Yeah.
I don't even know how to start. If I break my screen, I throw out the phone. Like, It's not
Yeah,
relatable,
yeah, yeah.
but you can probably relate to breaking your phone screen and having to throw it out. Like
100%.
it's the littler stories, and it's one of those things where it's like you learn from watching people who are great at something, and storytelling is the same way. You can learn from the people who are great, and I learned from stand-up comedians a lot. And not to say like I'm a stand-up comedian and I'm so
Not
funny,
yet.
but someday.
Yeah.
But the way that they tell stories, they can get an entire room to laugh and to react at the same story because they are intentionally talking about things that are relatable. Like it's like the classic, like, what about airline food? Like those stupid little commonalities that we all have. When you focus on those commonalities, you'll get the entire room to react.
Right.
And they don't have to react in like shock and awe. They just have to react.
Yeah, no, it's a great comparison with storytelling and comedians because that's really like their superpower is they take the mundane. You know, it's funny if you really dissect a comedian's bit. Sometimes it's like the most mundane thing that happened in their life, but they say it in such a funny way that just is what the hilarious part is about it. And it just connects to exactly what you're saying in terms of like, you don't need the epic story. You just need to take something in your life and tell it in a really great way. And so anything can become a great story depending on how you tell it.
Yeah, I've always loved quotes. Like I have my first tattoo was a quote. Like I love quotes. And so I started every chapter with one. And one of the ones that I used was Ira Glass. And he said, great stories happen to those who can tell them. And I read that one day and it was just so profound to me because it's so true. It's like you can go through something that is so insane and sensational and could be headline worthy, but if you don't tell it and like you don't talk about it and you don't talk about it well, who cares? No one's going to hear it. But then you can take something like airline food and have like an entire stadium reacting to it because you just told it well.
So it sounds like a lot of that requires a lot of reflection because these things happen to us every day. But if we're
Mhm.
not actively reflecting on our day and thinking through what inspired me today, what changed my life, you know, as small as it could have been, it kind of diverted me in a new direction or whatever. If we're not actively thinking through those things, it's tough to know where those stories are. And one other thing I loved in your book is you're a big About Time fan,
I love that movie.
right? And for those who don't know, it's a classic rom com that incorporates some sci fi with time traveling, but like in a romantic way. It's one of my favorite rom coms as well.
I'm glad at least one person knew that movie. I literally said in the book, I'm like, are we allowed to use obscure movie references? Because nobody in my life has ever heard of that movie.
Really?
Yes, everyone that I'm like, have you seen, like, what's your favorite movie? Have you seen About Time? And they're like,
It
no.
is kind
And
of
they always
like
ask, what's it about? Which is
it
my
is kind
favorite
of
because
like
I get to say time.
an underground classic.
It's so
But if
good.
you know, you know.
Yeah,
So anyway,
you should know.
we'll fan over or stan over About Time at a different podcast. But for this one, you mentioned there's kind of like an analogy you have on kind of the reflecting on your day because there's an element to the movie at the end. I mean, spoiler warning on what we're about to talk about if you haven't seen About Time yet. But there's a great correlation you have on the idea of reflecting on your day with About Time. So for those who haven't seen it, maybe you want to kind of tee it up and then kind of give an idea of what that process is for helping you figure out what stories are worth sharing.
Yeah. So in the movie, he's a time traveler and he's able to go back to different times in his life. And when he became an adult and was really like like stabilized in this whole idea that he can do this, he would go through his whole life and you would see him just going through the motions, but then he would go back in time and relive it and actually pay attention to those small details. And it's one of my favorite scenes because you see him like finally appreciate the barista smiling at him, and he was annoyed by the guy with too loud music on the subway, but in the second time he's dancing along to it. And it's all about that perspective. And at towards the end he stops going back in time, and he just tries to live every moment and every day as if he has intentionally traveled back to that day. And I think that's just such a great way to look at life. If you are so intentional about like this, I'm here for a reason, like I'm experiencing this day for a reason, and you're paying attention to why. And I mean, they say like not every day is good, but there's good in every day. So pay attention to those little moments that if you were just going through the motions, you would have missed, because those little moments can turn into such great stories. And like with, I go to conferences all the time, and the things that the places I learn the most are in the hallways with people that I just meet passing and end up, we share our whole life story online for coffee. And when you're just going through the motions, and I'm at a conference, I got to go to every session and take notes. It's like you're missing out on those little things. So it's like those are what you should be paying attention to.
Yeah, yeah. And that's tough too, because I feel like we get so wrapped up in our day that we're always thinking about like the future, what I like assignment I have to do, something with a client, whatever. So at the end of the day, we're just thinking about our next day,
Mm-hmm.
when in reality what's kind of like supporting us as content creators, as storytellers, is actually to go and reflect on the day we just had, or even just like our life stories, and find what like the good is in that day. And I'm sure there's a lot of like
Yeah.
therapy in that as well, right? Like people journal for a reason. So it's kind of like a, it's two birds, one stone in a way, I would assume.
Yeah. I think we go through the motion so much, and it's we're always looking towards what might happen later, but we don't know what's going to happen. The only thing that we know is what's already happened. So it's like you can't, they say like I can't write this, like you can't make this stuff up. Like you can make up what's going to happen later, but you can't make up what's already happened. Like pay attention to that, because that's what has happened, and you can turn that into the stories that have value.
Right. And what other element to your book here, again, I'm just going to be standing on your book the whole time here, but is you
I'm
wrote,
okay with it.
becoming a thought leader begins when we recognize the limited viewpoints of the status quo and the need for change. And I love this sentence. We need to kick that status right in the quo and offer up a perspective that we know is valuable but hasn't been told. And I think this is another misconception when it comes to people wanting to tell their story, is this idea that people don't want to tell their story because they feel there's already so much noise in their industry. People are already talking about it, they're already giving value, and they don't feel as though maybe they have any additional value to add. But here, what you're saying is like, there's always a gap in what's being said because not everyone has your story, your perspective, your unique take or skills. So yeah, I love this concept. Can you guys speak to it a bit more, what you were trying to convey here in terms of like, there is a place for you in all of the noise?
Yeah. Just like we live in the 24-hour news cycle, so we think everything has to be like sensational. We also live in an information age. Like at our fingertips at any moment, we can know anything. Like you can Google anything. So that's why like I feel stories are so important, because you can't Google them. So if you're talking about a topic because you love that topic, it's not the topic that's important, it's your experience around it. Because I could go and Google your topic and learn about it, but I can't Google your story. So if you're able to craft that story in a way that grabs attention, they don't have to resort to Google. Like you're the one thing that just can't be replicated. And our personal stories are our most valuable asset, because they are what make us stand out from that noise.
Yeah. Yeah. What I always like to say is kind of there's this uniqueness scale, and on the far end is like facts, and no one really owns facts. Everyone can
Mm-hmm.
Google the same thing and then, spit that out over a piece of content. But as you kind of go up the uniqueness scale, you get your specific story, brand, style, and that's what people are subscribing to, quote unquote subscribing to, is like how you present the facts. And that's why there's like different mediums and different channels and different ways. They're all reporting on the same thing, but it's like the how of that information that makes them stand out. So no, it's a really great concept. I know one thing at the top of our podcast earlier, before the podcast, I should say, we were talking about a little bit of imposter syndrome, with the idea of you said you didn't want to write a book, but you kind of got, I guess, forced into it. And then while writing this book, you have a chapter all on imposter syndrome. Were you feeling it was some of the hesitation for not writing the book, maybe a little bit about like, oh, am I equipped to be writing this, or where kind of did the imposter syndrome bleed in? And then can you kind of speak to, all right, if we feel, we're all going to feel it, but how do we get over
Yeah. Come back to me about the getting over it part because still haven't done that. But I think I give some tips, but I'm like, I'm still working on it
it?
too.
Yeah.
It definitely, imposter syndrome was a huge roadblock for me. And I worked on this book for over a year. And every single time I worked on it, the main thought in my head was, what am I doing? It's like, why do people need to hear from me? Who am I to write a book? But then on the other side of it, it's like, who is anybody else to write a book? Like, what makes me different than them? And if my perspective is a little bit different than theirs, like, what harm does it do to put that additional perspective out there? And there's a common misconception with the whole concept of thought leadership. And it's like, if I want to be a thought leader and I want to put my thoughts into the world, I think that every person needs to hear what I have to say. And every person is going to want to hear what I have to say. And that's completely untrue. I don't think everyone needs to hear what I have to say. But if you're a person who really wants to tell their story and isn't sure how, my book can help you. So it's not about we think we need to reach everybody. It's we think that if we reach the right person, we can help them. And that's enough. So I guess that was really my goal. Is just I want to reach the one person that needs it.
And I mean, even going back to what we were just saying about it's not always about the what, but a lot of times the how. When reading your book, your writing style was so fun to read. It like sounds like you write the way that you would just have a conversation, the way that you talk, which is like very, free form. There's humor and incorporated into it. So it was like fun to read versus if someone else was to have written the same book, but maybe had taken a different tone to it, that maybe wouldn't have resonated with me as much. So it's not always about the what, because your unique style makes me want to continue to read the book, which means I'm actually going to be able to absorb the information better and like actually learn something, versus again, if it was someone else who maybe had a bit more monotone approach to it, didn't incorporate humor, then I'm not maybe finishing that book, or I'm struggling through it and I'm just like forcing myself to learn something. So yeah, it's almost, I think that your style of writing feels very authentic to you. And you actually talk about this as well when in storytelling, how to remain authentic through that. Can you guys speak to how is it a conscious decision when you write to be writing in the tone that you are, or is it just kind of like it'd be too much effort to be any other way? Like how do you remain authentic when you're writing, and then how can you help others remain authentic as well?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that.
For sure.
I'm
Again, this is
I'm
this is the Stan hour on your book.
I love this hour.
Yeah, right.
Um, it was like consciously unconscious. It's like if I were going to try to write it any other way, that would have had to be a conscious effort. I wrote it the way I would have said it. And it really, like, if I were to have done it any other way, I feel like I might as well have not written the book. Cuz I also, the way that I wrote it is part education, part journal, part memoir, basically. Because if I'm going to teach you why it's important for you to tell your story and how all the different ways to tell it, I need to teach it through stories, or else I'm not making my point. And it's all, I talk about authenticity and how the way that you tell your story has to be true to you and it has to be really personal. and then I go and write the book in somebody else's voice because I feel like that's what people expect to read, then again, I might like that. I feel like that would mean I don't have the right to write this book.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
when I think before, like what gives me the right to write it, I have that. But if I were to just do it the other way, no. Let it like let the person that actually would write that way write that book.
Right. You're walking the walk as well as talking the talk.
Yeah, exactly. And it would have been so much more difficult for like I would basically have to be translating it. Like how can I translate me into like professional speak? And I did that for many years. I worked in the finance industry. And I go into that a little bit in part because it is part of my story, but I spent years trying to just fit myself into this role of financial professional. And even though I knew finance and I'm accredited as a financial counselor and I know what I'm talking about in finance, I am not a financial professional. I am not the buttoned up, everything is blue and green and gray and monotone. Like, it's just not me. And when I left the industry to do my own thing, it was to give myself permission to just be unapologetically myself in every situation I'm in. And the book is just one of those situations. It's written as me. My friends have read it and said, like, yeah, that was just a conversation with you. It's it is so genuine because I'm tired of not being that.
Did you see? I mean, you wrote. Sounds like you wrote content that wasn't necessarily your voice, your style, like your essence, and then you finally were able to just kind of like break through that barrier and write authentically you. Did you see a difference in maybe like the performance of your content besides like how easy maybe it was for you to obviously write more authentically? Was there a result in terms of like people were taking notice, maybe performance of content, or even just like people appreciating the content more?
It's a little weird because when I was doing most of the content and for the writing, I was actually ghostwriting for financial professionals, but I had trained my brain to write like them to the point that I actually basically developed their voice, and I was able to write in a way that sounded like them. And it wasn't so much the difference that I saw in the audience, it was the difference that I saw in myself. That is what I paid attention to when I walked away from that. And I'm still working in finance. A lot of my biggest clients are in finance, and I love being able to work with them and the work that I do. But being able to do it as myself just makes so much of a difference. And I think that the work I do is better because I'm not stressed over, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to act the wrong way? Am I not suitable for the conversations that I'm having in this space? Instead, I get to feel more confident and feel more like myself, and it just makes me do better work.
What are some common mistakes people will make when trying to tell their story?
Not telling it at all is the biggest one.
Mic drop on
I
that.
think
Yeah.
people are afraid to be open. I can't blame them. Like, it's a very scary thing to do. And we all have pieces of our story that either we're not proud of or we're embarrassed about or we're just scared to talk about. And I think that's okay. No one is telling you you have to tell everything. Just pick out the pieces that are going to have that impact and are going to reach the people that you're trying to reach. And there's a book, one of my favorite writers, I talk about him way too much, is Austin Kleon. I have sent him emails like begging him to like write my forward, and I'm waiting for my restraining order. But he has a book called Show Your Work,
Yes.
and
Okay.
it goes along that same idea of like if you have this work that you're putting out and these ideas, no one's gonna know if you don't show it. And that's the biggest mistake people make is that they just don't.
Why do you think people, I guess, are maybe afraid to tell their story? Is there like common themes that you see of why people just never press publish?
One of it would definitely be the imposter syndrome, the like, who am I to talk about this? But one of it's probably we live in an age of internet trolls and you're putting yourself up to be criticized and torn apart by people who you've never met who hide behind a screen. And that can be
Usually the
really
ones that,
hard.
that don't have a profile picture too. you
Oh
know?
yeah, no, I've been bullied by a lot of gray silhouettes, and I don't like gray silhouettes anymore. They're not my friends.
Yeah,
But
the username is like
bunch of
sly
numbers,
guys.
bunch of letters,
Right, yeah.
like
Yeah,
I slept with your
easy for you
mom,
to
XXX.
right, right. Yeah, what's been your experiences with obviously as we publicize ourselves online and we do want to present value in a confident way where it's like, hey, we know what we're talking about. That does put us in a vulnerable position where people who disagree or just having a bad day want to voice their opinion about maybe how they don't agree with us or whatever. What has been your experience with that, and then how do you usually handle that? You know, in a response or just touch grass. What's kind of your strategy?
So the first thing on that, it's kind of why stories are so important, because anyone, if you post something, anyone can go up and just say you're wrong. And if you give information, they can say you're wrong, you're lying, or you made that up, or it's just untrue. They can't say that about your story. They can't tell you, like, oh no, you did not go through that. Like, it's just, they're just gonna look kind of dumb.
Yeah,
So I think that's part of it, is just if you lead with those stories, you're not able to have that, like those trolls that are going to just argue with everything, I guess. But the other part is, I have been very intentional about just making it very clear that I know I am not perfect. And I put out podcast episodes that have my bloopers in them. And if I say something stupid and no one hears it, I'll repeat it so people know that I just said the dumbest thing, because someone else has to know how dumb this thing I just said was. Like, I am publicly imperfect because it is authentic, and I'm not doing it just because I'm like, oh, let me just put this out and people will think this. It's like, no, I'm just being myself. I'm being authentic. And I think when you do that, it takes the power away from everybody else, because what are you going to say about me that I didn't just say?
this is the B Rabbit approach.
I was about to say Eminem rap battle.
Yeah, we watch a
This
lot of
is
the
Eight
same movies
Mile.
here.
Yes, this is 8 Mile. And I'm going to say everything that you're about to say about me.
Right, right. Leave them
But it's
speechless.
really true. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really true. It's like you can tell me I look stupid. Okay, go watch the video back. I said I look stupid.
right.
Like, I know. So I think that's part of it. It's like, don't be afraid to show like the imperfections. And when we try to put on this facade of we are perfect, that is when we're going to get the most hate, because everyone else knows you're not,
Yeah,
because nobody is. So
yeah.
just embrace the fact that you know it too, and it shuts everybody up, because what are they going to say?
And I find like when you do try to come off overly polished, to some people look at that and go, "Oh well, like this guy really knows what he's talking about," or whatever. But then it does at the same time. I think it gives off like the wrong impression. Opens the door for those trolls 100%, but at the same time it's like it's unrelatable, as we talked about
Mm-hmm.
earlier on the podcast, where it's like everything is perfect, like scripted and edited, and like I 100% go through this right now where like I'm trying to wheel that back a little bit. And yeah, so you get caught in this like I need to come off overly polished because then I'll be respected more and people will take me more seriously. But the more you do that, the less relatable you are, and the less people kind of like take you seriously because you feel too far gone from reality of like the every man, every woman type of thing. And I see like a lot of these. In fact, I mean, TikTok's a better channel for this because Instagram's a little bit more of like the polished platform. But
Mm.
you go on TikTok and you see some of these accounts that blow up, and it's literally just a person with iPhone on their couch speaking their truth every day,
Mm-hmm.
and it's less about them looking super polished and no makeup, no like fancy backdrop, or you know hair's messy, whatever, but they're just spitting facts, and people just relate to that
Yeah.
more. And I can connect with that. But if you're just like overly polished on everything, you're like, this feels this feels too disconnected from what I'm used to.
Yeah, and I mean, I work in podcast production. I have a podcast production house, and we actively do not take out all of the ums and buts and likes and stuff from clients because it just makes them sound like robots. And we see it in what's performing right now. And the videos that are more raw and are more just like you said, like a selfie video of someone holding up an iPhone, those do perform better than a lot of these highly produced videos. And not only do they perform better, they're a lot easier to make. Like you
100%. I
can
was just
take
about to say
10
that.
hours
Yeah.
to create this beautiful cinematic worthy video, and then someone swoops in with like a clip that they just took on their couch in their pajamas and it gets like 4 times the views because that's what people want. We've had so many years of things looking perfect. And now, with how prominent social is, and with TikTok and Reels and all of this, people see through it. Like they see through the bullshit. And I'm sorry, I don't know if I can curse on your show,
Oh, 100%.
but
Fucking do it.
they see through it. And if you're trying to be that perfect person, they're not going to know who you are. And especially with what I do with like content creation and podcasting stuff, I'm doing it to represent my business. And if you see me on a podcast and you think, oh, I want to work with her, and then you come work with me and I'm a completely different person, that's you're not going to want to stay working with me. It's like, I
Right.
want you to see me, feel like you know who I am, and then come work with me because you want to work with me, not this brand I put out there.
Right. Yeah. Because otherwise, then you have to put that performance on every time you have a client call or something,
That's
right?
that's a lot of effort.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to just not.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. They want to buy you first before they buy your offer. And if you're like representing you as something completely different, then yeah, they don't know what they're buying into.
Yeah, it's like I don't go on these things to sell a product. I don't go on these to sell a service. I go on these to sell myself as just this
Yeah.
is who I am, and if you connect with me, like let's connect.
No
And
false
if that
advertising.
exactly, like if that turns into something that makes me money, that's amazing. And if it doesn't, I made a friend.
Sure.
Like half of my friends are podcasters that I've never met
Oh, really?
that are like, "Oh, I have so many friends that are not even in the same country that like they're some of my biggest supporters. I have never met them."
Oh, wow. I feel like it's podcasting such a. I mean, I just launched this like a month ago, and I had no idea what I was getting into and the steps involved in podcasting. And I feel like those who have launched one, especially a video podcast, and all the like you saying, the editing that goes into it, and uploading to YouTube, and the details that go into that. It's a lot. It's more than I thought. So like I feel like there's shared trauma there that maybe you can bond
Oh,
over.
we'll trauma bond over that. Don't worry.
Yeah, out of yeah, yeah. Anyway, so on this note too about showing up authentically because you want your audience to know the real you, and the goal of that is because you want your audience to know, like, and trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And you speak to this in your book as well, as kind of like the importance of that and how to accomplish that. Now, I don't want to give away. I feel like I'm almost giving away too much of this book, but whatever you feel comfortable talking about in terms of the importance of your audience knowing and liking and trusting you, and like what that leads to, and some ways that you can accomplish that through your content and your story.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give away the farm. There's not enough time for me to read the whole book. But, the know like trust process, it is really vital, and there is so much distrust in the world these days. And I know I'm like everything is about stories, but I do actually have some like statistics in the book, and I think it was like 85% of business owners, like business executives, think that their consumers trust them, but the consumers is only like 27% agree. Like there is this huge just like
Disparity.
yeah, between businesses that think that people trust them and the ones that act and people actually trusting them. And a lot of that is because we see through the bullshit now. like brands have to be more than a logo. And for the longest times, these big brands are nothing but logos. And it's part of the whole movement towards like small businesses and supporting the mom and pop shops. And it's so true because if you don't feel like you know the person, then you're not going to like the person and then you're not going to trust the person. And trust is brand equity at this point. And it always makes me think of like real estate, and they have like those massive like real estate companies that are across the whole country, like Keller Williams and stuff. And if I think of like, okay, I need a realtor, I'm going to call Keller Williams. No, but the real estate agents are buying like their pictures on a park bench, and they're like, you see it every single day, and it's like, this isn't an ad for Keller Williams, it's just like, this is Brenda. And then I need to buy a house, I'm just like, I'm gonna call Brenda because that's her. I see her, I feel like I know her, she's everywhere, and it's her, not her logo. And that's all about personal branding. And when you put yourself out there as yourself, that is just representing a company instead of putting yourself out as a company, it's a world of difference.
Yeah, I there's this idea that I kind of been playing with the idea of, there's Flo from Progressive and there's Jake from State Farm and things, right? And these are like the humanization of a logo
Mm-hmm.
because people buy from people. So,
Yeah.
or they buy from, cartoon characters that are trying to sell you like sugar cereal or something. But
Well, it's great.
right,
So,
right. Yeah, I'll buy from Tony all day. So, um, but yeah, so it's like a logo, a brand, a company has ideally like, morals and beliefs and missions and such, but it's, you can't really represent that through like an icon.
yeah.
So they take these mascots, essentially human mascots, to represent those things. And so we feel like we know Jake from State Farm or maybe Flo from Progressive, but Jake from State Farm is at like the Super Bowl or something, hanging with, Mama Kelsey. So we feel like, oh, I can vibe with that. So
Yeah.
yeah, when you buy into the person, then there could be an offer on the other side, but really I'm like buying it to you first.
Yeah. And you mentioned like missions and values and stuff. I don't know the stats off the top of my head. I know I have them in the book, but people are more and more likely, like as the years go by, they want to support brands that support a mission. They want mission driven companies. They want to support brands that they know are doing something for a cause. Like it can't just be like, we know that your CEO drives 14 cars and has 4 houses. We don't care. We want to know that you're doing something for somebody else. And especially in the younger generations, like the millennials are going to be a huge piece of the like corporate, not, like the consumer base, and Gen Z even bigger. And the younger we get, and I guess the more we pay attention to these kinds of things, the more we want to see that, and we want to see businesses that are supporting things that we believe in, because there's so many brands out there. Like you can buy Nike or Reebok or Adidas, like there's like, you don't need to just buy one brand. So the way that you need to be competing as a brand is by leading with those values and that mission, and just proving that you're not just here for yourself, because
Right.
that selfish part of business is dying off with the older generations.
Yeah, I've felt this when you're talking about like coming from the finance space and speaking that language and doing a lot of ghostwriting. So you're constantly, using that language and trying to mimic the writing styles of that
Mm-hmm.
industry or a person. And then you try to transition into writing for yourself and authentically, whatever. I went through a similar experience, and like early in my career, I was doing a lot of like direct response marketing or helping this one company with direct response marketing. And this is like prime direct response marketing, like bullshit, where you drive someone to like a sales page and it's just like direct response marketing word vomit on a page, and it's using all the words to try to inspire emotion or whatever. And like there's
Yeah.
granted there's time and place for this stuff, but this was like the stuff that you, as you mentioned, we're starting to see through now. Like, oh, I've seen this same landing page 100 times. I've been
Mm-hmm.
told there's a flash sale and I need to get this done ASAP, or something will expire. Like, people are just kind of exhausted by some of this stuff. And
I
early
am
in my
people.
career,
I am people. I am
you
tired of that.
you as
Please
people,
stop. Please stop.
public service announcement today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
And yeah, me included. It's funny. Like, but I got my start in, like, I was like a protege to someone who was very deep in the direct response space. And so I got my early learnings about marketing, like, from this person that very much spoke this language as like a first language. And so I'm like, okay, this is how marketing works. And it's been such a difficult time trying to, like, pull myself out of that mindset to be like, all right, you have to stop using this type of language and, like, write the way that you speak, because yeah, no one wants to hear this shit anymore. And or no, I don't know if anyone ever wanted to really hear it, but it
But
was
it's all
just
they
so,
had.
yeah, it just worked. So they, a
Yeah.
lot of it,
But
it would,
no one was doing it differently.
right,
So it's like that was the only option.
right.
And now people are finally doing it differently.
Yeah, I think it's very much like a pendulum, or maybe it's a cycle, in the sense that, yeah, if we're pushing a certain thing down your throat so much, the next creative way to do it is like the opposite. And so now we're like in this authenticity swing where,
Finally.
yeah, this is our moment.
No, and I feel the same way. It's like even if like this is how it's been done, you can still do it differently. And I love that you realize that. And I did too. When I joined the financial planning firm, I joined it like I had just lost my job. I just moved to a new city and like didn't know anybody. And I was just like, all right, I need to do something. So I took the job, even though I had told like the CEO I would never work for him. And just because I'm like, I don't like finance and I don't like financial planning. Financial planning to me was like a playground for the rich. And it's just like, let's help rich people get more rich. And that's not part of my mission. That is not what I'm trying to do. But I still took the job, but I still knew that the way that they did business was not okay with me. Like it didn't align with just like what I wanted. And I just didn't have it in me to just go with it. So the first project that I set, like as I was director of marketing, so I had a pretty decent marketing budget. And I said, the first thing I want to do with this budget is create a free online course to teach high school kids about money because nobody's doing it. Like I didn't learn about credit cards till I was like 20. And I texted all my friends like, hey, what like questions do you have about finances? And it was all the same stuff and it was the basics. So that was the first thing I did was create this free online course. And then that turned into more ebooks and on other online courses and articles and webinars and all of this content that ended up we launched a financial literacy media company underneath this financial planning firm, and we just use it as this place to just disseminate all of this information and all of these things that nobody is being taught. And if they are being taught, it's not being taught by people who should be teaching it. Like there's so many like finance coaches online that they did something, it worked for them, so now I'm going to teach other people how to do it. That does not mean it's going to work for other people, and they're not going to figure that out until it ruins their life. So it's like if we have all of these people that know what they're talking about and they're so smart and they're accredited and they have designations, let's have them put out some information. So we did that. And then the firm changed their whole business model, got rid of asset minimums, became a firm that brought in families of any wealth level, whether you had money to invest or not. So I I guess just I was just too stubborn to go with the flow and like stick to the status quo that I just didn't. And they had two options: either get rid of me and find someone who would do it their way, or listen to me and let me do it my way. And thankfully for me, they chose my way. But it worked out for them too. And they started doing all of this stuff. They've won awards for it. And it's been so amazing to see that transformation. And I don't take credit for the changes that they made. Like they did that. I don't know how to restructure a financial company. That is all them. but I was able to be part of what started it. And that was amazing. And it goes back to just this idea of thought leadership. You don't have to be talking to the entire world. You could be a thought leader just talking to your coworkers. Like your audience is whoever you deem your audience is. And that was my audience. It was just the people I worked with.
Sure. Yeah, that's crazy because and we talked about early on too is kind of creating content for the you 5 years ago, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's not, when you talk about like financial literacy, you mentioned not really understanding about credit cards until you were 20. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I
I thought
mean,
a 401k was a charity race. Like, that's too much running. I want nothing to do with it. I
right,
knew nothing. Nothing.
yeah, and you kind of, but they also say, the idea of you talk about being overly polished or coming across as too much of a thought leader, where people feel you're too disconnected from where they are currently.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's best just to be giving the 101 stuff because maybe you're at chapter 3 and people who are at chapter 1 just want that person who's like only a few chapters ahead to be telling them what to do and saying it in a way that they can vibe with. Again, like, I want to read your book because of the information, but also because of the way that you wrote it. And I feel like, I can relate to this versus someone who maybe is like the PhD person who's going to write it in a very different style. I feel very disconnected from that person. So you don't, again, yeah, like you're saying, it's like, you don't have to be necessarily the Gary V's of your industry to feel like you have a story to tell or like, valid in giving information, essentially.
Yeah. I was at this conference a couple months ago, and one woman just straight up looked at me and said, "I have so many more years of experience than you. What do you think you could possibly teach me?" And because I was the youngest person there by far. And I just looked at her. I'm like, is that the mindset that you go through life with? Like, you have to reach a certain age in order to be deemed like acceptable to know anything. I'm like, I learn from children every day. Like, I learn from people that are in their teens. I learn from people younger than me. I learn from people older than me. Everybody has a different experience. And if you're teaching from your own experience, then you have something to teach. And I think we have to remember that too. It's like, no matter where they're starting from or where they're at in their journey, even if you don't personally think that you can learn something from them, somebody else can. So it's like, kind of just shut up and get out of the way, I
Well,
guess.
especially if you're going to come into the mindset with you have nothing to teach me, then you're going to be right because you're not going to
Yeah,
accept.
that's fine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're not going to
That's fine. I
accept
don't I don't I
what
don't
the
have to
person's
teach you
saying.
anything.
Right. Yeah. 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 Then don't
Can't.
show up.
What is it? Open mouths and closed minds inevitably come on the same person.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like, what is the other quote where it's like, I think it's, Henry Ford or something where it's like, if you think you can or you can't, you're right.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so if you kind of come into these situations with the idea of, I already know everything, then sure. You're not going to learn anything new because
Then
you're
you
just
know
going to assume.
everything you'll ever know.
Yeah. Yeah. You've done it. You've
You'll
learned
never know.
everything
Yeah.
you could possibly
You,
know.
yep. And you'll
Um,
never learn anything else.
so, one area I want to talk about is we talk about being vulnerable in content,
Mm-hmm.
and it's difficult. But some people I can understand where, to be vulnerable means to shed light into kind of your personal space, things, whether it be emotional or family matters or what have you. There's some things that people want to draw a line on with it when it comes to like, oh, I don't want to post about my kids. I don't want to,
Yeah.
post that I'm on vacation and all that kind of stuff, for security reasons, what have you. How can people think about creating a sphere of, vulnerability, if you will, where they say, okay, this is what I'm willing to talk about, And is it okay then to kind of leave some other things out? Or, how deep do you really have to go with vulnerability and letting people into your life? Because I think that's a large hiccup of why people don't start a personal brand or feel uncomfortable about starting one, is because they don't want to let people in too much. So yeah, how do we
And
kind of draw that line in the sand?
yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, everybody is entitled to their boundaries. Nobody is entitled to somebody else's life. And when you're telling your story, you can choose how much of that story you want to tell. So if you don't want to talk about your children or show photos of your children, don't. I don't blame you. This is a scary world, but you can still lean into being a parent. And how did parenthood affect your like your story and your decisions? Or don't. Just talk about it from your professional life. It's completely up to you. And I think we almost feel like we have to talk about everything. Like we have this forced vulnerability. And it always makes me think of like American Idol, and every single person that auditions for American Idol, they have a sob story. And if they don't, I feel like they just make one up. You don't need to have a sob story. Just talk about the truth and talk about what you know and you're passionate about, whether or not it's like the deep traumatic stories. My story was about a tattoo. You don't have to lead with trauma.
Yeah, because that's the main thing I see with people in their um, personal brand, is they don't want to either come across as trying too hard, like a try hard with their content and being like a thought leader, and I know what I'm talking about, so listen up. And they also don't, on the other end of things, don't want to be too much of this, like, here's my personal life, you know, here's me at the beach, here's me with my kids,
Yeah.
here's, my inner thoughts, and I'm being overly vulnerable. Like sometimes there's kind of like a spectrum that you want to be in with thought leadership and, vulnerable personal content, and you kind of have to like thread that needle a little bit. Do you have kind of maybe a, not an equation, but a ratio maybe of how much content you want to post as like a thought leader and how much content you want to post that's more vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to your level of comfort. You don't have to share anything you don't want to share, but also your personal brand and like what you're putting out into the world for thought leadership, it's not supposed to be this like 24-hour reality show of your life. You don't have to show all of it. It's just focusing on the things that matter to your message. So it comes down to choosing your stories. And if the message that you're trying to get across is related to things that are solely professional, pick stories from your professional life. You don't have to pull those childhood memories and try to get tears when they're not necessary. Like you can tell case studies, you can talk about testimonials. So I think it really is just think about what your message is and what you're trying to get out into the world. Why do you want to be a thought leader? Why do you want to be sharing like your thoughts, your opinions, your perspectives? And then choose the stories that are going to just help you do that, that are going to portray what it is you're trying to say. Because if you just start pulling in these stories just because you're like, well, someone online told me I have to make someone cry today, it's like, no, you don't. You can tell a story that's more simple and that's just, this is how I help my client do this. Like that is okay too. Because as long as it relates to and illustrates the point you're trying to make, you've done the job.
Love it. And on the note of being authentic and real, we have dealt with so many technical difficulties during this entire podcast. My my camera has turned off like 4 times.
I knocked
Due
mine
to,
over.
yeah, she knocked yours over. I'm not gonna name names on the software I'm using, but we've had some technical difficulties with that. But I think I appreciate you being a trooper through this whole thing. I just launched this podcast like a month ago, and I'm there's some growing pains I'm working
You're
through. So
doing great. You're doing
yeah,
great.
yeah, appreciate. Well, let's wrap this up before my camera overheats again, and we
It's
have
like a
to.
ticking time bomb.
Yeah, who else? What else is gonna happen here? So anyway, I appreciate so much you coming on and telling your story. And people want to learn more about you and your new book. Where should they go?
Go to openthisbook.com and you'll see my book, everything about it, and you'll be able to find out a little bit more about me, my services, find my contacts, my socials, everything is there. So open this book.
So get it. Buy it first, then
Open
open
it.
it. Yeah. I got the Kindle version though, so it's more like a swipe than it is a
Swipe this
physical.
book.
Swipe that book. There it is. That's the prequel. Love it.
No.
Appreciate you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much.